Tonight on Bridge City News, the Alberta woman who caused distress to hundreds of dogs near Milk River received her punishment. A new poll says Alberta Premier Jason Kenney's popularity has taken a bit of a hit lately. Our legislative reporter Tyler Dawson has the details. And BCN's Loris Alexander looks into the importance of the Salvation Army's Christmas Kettle campaign and its impact on our community.
Your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News with Hal Robbins.
Good evening. Thanks so much for joining us. The woman who made national headlines after she was charged with causing distress to around 200 dogs in her care received her punishment yesterday. Judge Derek Redman handed down his verdict in Lethbridge Court. April Dawn Irving has been prohibited from owning dogs the rest of her life, but only while she lives in Alberta. The 59-year-old woman was also fined more than $15,000. Irving was also found guilty of similar offenses in 2010 in Saskatchewan. She pleaded guilty to the Lethbridge charges in July. The Crown heard that she abused the dogs on a property near Milk River in 2014. Crown Prosecutor Tyler Redmond said this was one of the most comprehensive animal distress cases in Canada's history. A Calgary man who disappeared under suspicious circumstances in 2015 has now been identified. Police say the remains found 13 months ago near Slave Lake, Alberta, are those of 27-year-old Bradley Shaw. Dental records were used to confirm his identity. RCMP released a composite sketch a year after his remains were discovered, and Calgary police say an investigator with the Missing Persons Unit saw it and suspected the man was Shaw. The cause of death has not been released, but police say a homicide investigation will continue. A new survey by the Alberta Motor Association shows many Albertans are concerned with the road risks associated with edibles. Edibles are food products like brownies infused with marijuana. More than 25% of drivers were unsure about the potential dangers of edibles and their effects on driving. Another is 1 in 4 drivers did not know about the danger compared to smoking or vaping cannabis. A 2019 CAA study in Ontario found that 72% of cannabis users drove within 3 hours of consuming the drug, and 27% admitted they felt high while behind the wheel. Now here's a look at the numbers when it came to Alberta drivers and edibles. 45% feel that those who consume edibles pose the same risk as smoking or vaping cannabis. 26% don't know the risks compared to smoking or vaping, and 24% think edibles are riskier than smoked or vaped cannabis. 5% of Albertans believe that edibles are safer for drivers than smoked or vaped products. Now, as for selling edibles and other cannabis products, local business owners are getting quite frustrated with the provincial government.
Now comes edible, I have to rearrange my whole entire store in a certain part. That is there going to be need coolers? Can we do this? Can we do that? Well, Health Canada and AGLC really doesn't know. And once we do it, then they'll say, oh, yes or no, you can have this or you can do this. That's what they're doing. And it's making it very stressful for business owners like me, independent and owner and operated. And it's just going through changes, and it costs, and it's a cost is reoccurring, and it's coming more and more. And it's just hard to deal with government regulated because they don't know what they're doing. It's like we're trying to figure out what we're doing, right? And when we do it, they say, no, you can't do it. Well, we spend the money doing it, right? And then they say no, right? So edible is going to be another challenge.
Pan says federal license holders need to provide 60 days notice of their intent to sell any new product. He says edibles will likely not be available until later this month. Around 30,000 new cases of Lyme disease are reported in the United States each year. In Canada, the numbers are also on the rise. They're likely to increase as infected ticks continue to migrate north. Audrey Skoog became an unlikely advocate for Lyme disease when she contracted it herself. She spoke at SACPA earlier today and says the disease is often misdiagnosed.
Normally I do public speaking in the human services arena, and this is something close to my heart because I've been so ill with it, and I had no idea how to advocate for myself. I didn't know much about the disease, so I'm hoping just to educate others on how they can keep themselves safe, things they can do to advocate with their physician, because when you have a rare disease, doctors aren't going to recognize it right away. It's not like when you go to the doctor with the flu and they're like, here's your medication. I don't ever say that, you know, being sick is a self-help program, because that's ridiculous, right? I'm not into inspiration porn, but I do believe that you can, you can assign meaning to the things in your life, right, and move forward and move on and still impact your community and your society as a whole.
In 2017, there were more than 1,400 cases of Lyme disease reported in Canada. There are many people in our country who love our healthcare system and want to leave it just the way it is. There are others, however, who believe that we should also have private healthcare to help alleviate wait times. You can include Derek Fromm in that group. Derek is a lawyer with the Constitution Foundation. He says private health care should be a fundamental right for all Canadians.
Access to a waiting list is not access to health care. And it's a very important distinction. Just because the government has surgical facilities and can do the surgical procedures for you in their facility doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get it in a timely and effective way that will preserve your health. And if your health is at risk and you're suffering, it becomes a constitutional violation when the government doesn't allow you to solve your own medical problems.
Catch the full interview with Derek Fromm from the Constitution Foundation discussing private versus public health care. That's coming up in the second half of our show. Engineering students at the University of Victoria are expanding the reach of a nonprofit program that provides low-cost 3D printed prosthetic hands to amputees. They're offering 3D printed braces for children with scoliosis. A U of Vic professor says a $1 million grant will help fit 200 amputees and 160 kids with back braces to treat scoliosis over the next few years.
What we want to do is provide services for remote communities in Canada and underserved populations in the U.S. We're actually trying to discuss which regions would best be served. In Canada, providing services up north is very challenging for a whole bunch of factors, including transportation. But we're pretty resourceful, and we're going to try and figure out how to do that. Scoliosis is a congenital curvature of the spine, and it affects 3 out of 100 kids. So out of those 3 per 100, 1/10 of them will actually require bracing to correct it. Some of them can undergo just rehabilitation through basically exercise, but basically 3 per 1,000 need braces. And surprisingly, the braces are not covered by Canadian healthcare. And in the US, if you don't have insurance, you're not covered either. So there's actually a huge need in Canada and the US for this.
So are you looking for a way out of a parking ticket issued by Alberta Health Services? It's a Christmas miracle. The AHS launched its Toys for Tickets campaign this week, where you have the opportunity to donate a new unwrapped toy rather than paying your parking fine.
What we're doing is for anybody who has gotten a ticket within Alberta Health Services in the month of November of 2019, they can exchange that ticket. Rather than paying the ticket, they can provide a toy that has a value of $25 or greater, and they can essentially pay for their ticket with that toy. We're looking for toys for any age group between 1 and 17 years old that would be appropriate, and those will be distributed to our child patients or the children in the hospital over the Christmas season.
Toys will be accepted until December 13th at any AHS parking office. The Salvation Army of Lethbridge is looking to last-minute shoppers to help lift the Christmas Kettle campaign to its goal of $150,000. After all, it does not truly feel like Christmas until the kettles come out and the Salvation Army starts to raise funds for those in need. BCN's Loris Alexander finds out why we should dig deep and donate to the iconic Red Bucket.
It's a slow start to the 2019 Lethbridge Salvation Army Christmas Kettle campaign, but that's typical.
Most cities are very similar. You know, we'll usually have a 5 or a 6 week campaign depending on the city we're in, and typically the first couple 3 weeks, there's a little bit of a lull, and then this upswing begins. And certainly within the last 2 weeks leading up to Christmas Day, Christmas Eve, we see a significant increase in donations.
Money raised stays within the region in which it's collected.
Every dollar stays in Lethbridge and is used exclusively for Lethbridge ministry purposes. We run youth programming, we run thrift stores, we run community and family services, we run a furniture bank. So we're helping people in a multitude of ways throughout the entire year.
William Booth, an English evangelist, founded the Salvation Army in 1878 as a religious outreach to London's poor.
Rather than just, talk about it, we tend to be very good doers. And so as a result of the doing, of course, the gospel message is lived out. And that's really what it's all about. We are non-discriminatory. We help anybody and everybody with whatever need they may come to us with.
Volunteers like Jim Hutton have been around since the inception of the Salvation Army in Lethbridge. The reason he does it?
Because this supports families at Christmas. That's the primary reason. And that's the one time of the year when the need is greatest. And there are people who are without food or shelter or various other amenities during the Christmas season. And this is one way to help them out.
You can now tap your debit or credit card to make donations at select Christmas Kettle locations. For Bridge City News, I'm Loris Alexander.
It appears as though Alberta Premier Jason Kenney's popularity may have taken a bit of a hit lately. Tyler Dawson, who's the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, says the honeymoon with our new premier may be over.
I mean, he's just come off a bad month, I think, objectively speaking. He's had a rough month, from some of the spending stuff to Bill 22, where the elections commissioner was canned. He's had a rough go of it, and so I don't think it's a surprise that he has dropped in popularity, especially now that things like pensions are being talked about, things like healthcare cuts. These are tough spots for any politician, no matter how popular.
Tyler Dawson will also have details on why the average Albertan may not be sympathetic to public sector unions. That's coming up after business news. Scott Moe says he wants more control over immigration. The Saskatchewan premier says his government wants control over selecting classes and skills that would help grow the province's population. He says his province wants to have the ability to change the proportion of immigrants coming in under those categories. Moe is looking to Quebec as an example of how a province can collect its own taxes. He says Saskatchewan is exploring a similar option. It appears as though the candid comments caught on camera of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau speaking about U.S. President Donald Trump are still a topic of conversation. Federal NDP leader Jagmeet Singh says Trudeau can present very different public and private impressions.
What I've said often about Mr. Trudeau is that he certainly says some things in public and then says things very differently in private. For example, he talks about the importance of Indigenous relationships as being a priority in public, but in private, in a closed-door fundraiser with wealthy donors, he mocked and made fun of activists that were complaining about a legitimate concern about clean drinking water and mercury poisoning in Grassy Narrows. Very different approach in public and very different approach in private. And that's something that I've said before. There's many reasons to criticize Mr. Trump, but criticizing about making someone late to a cocktail party is not one. And these two Mr. Trudeau's in public and private is something that I've seen many times, and I think Canadians are starting to see more and more.
Federal Conservative leader Andrew Scheer is seeking to rally his MPs and senators after concerns have been raised about his leadership. His party hopes the focus will switch onto the Liberals with the return of the House of Commons today.
We are focused on one shared goal and prosperity, getting rid of a scandal-plagued, deficit-running Liberal government and replacing it with a Conservative government that puts Canadians first and will heal this country. We're not going to let them get away with anything. We're not going to let them get away with raising taxes or attacking small business owners. We're not going to let him attack our energy sector with bills like C-69. We're not going to allow him to cripple future generations by massive amounts of new debt. Canadians need their government to work for them, so let's get to work. The Canadian people are counting on us and our Conservative caucus. We will deliver for them. Let's get to work. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Governor General Julie Payette delivered her throne speech today, which highlighted the Liberals' commitments to tax breaks for the middle class, tackling climate change, and stricter gun control. South of the border, U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi says the House is moving toward drafted articles of impeachment against U.S. President Donald Trump. She says the president leaves us no choice but to act.
In America, no one is above the law. Over the past few weeks, through the Intelligence Committee working with the Foreign Affairs and Oversight Committees, the American people have heard the testimony of truly patriotic career public servants, distinguished diplomats, and decorated war heroes, some of the president's own appointees. The facts are uncontested. The president abused his power for his own personal political benefit at the expense of our national security by withholding military aid and crucial Oval Office meeting in exchange for an announcement of an investigation into his political rival.
The last American president to be impeached was Bill Clinton in December of 1998. He was charged with perjury and obstruction of justice. Clinton was impeached but was not removed from office by the United States Senate. An active duty U.S. sailor whose submarine was docked at Pearl Harbor opened fire on 3 civilian employees yesterday, killing 2 of them before taking his own life.
I can report that Joint Base security personnel did respond to the report of an active shooter today in the vicinity of Dry Dock 2 in the Naval Shipyard. I can confirm that there were 3 shooting victims. We have confirmed that 2 are deceased. 1 is in stable condition in a local hospital. I can also report the shooter, who has tentatively been identified as an active duty sailor assigned to USS Columbia, SSN 771, is also deceased by an apparent self-inflicted gunshot wound. I cannot share the names of the victims or the shooter at this time until we can confirm that next of kin notifications have been made. We have no indication yet whether they were targeted or if it was a random shooting.
Christmas is less than 3 weeks away now. Hundreds of people in New York got into the holiday spirit as they attended the annual tree lighting at Rockefeller Center. It was quite the visual spectacle.
3, 2, 1.
This is about as Christmassy as you can get. Nothing's more Christmassy than New York during the holidays, especially when you're going to light the Rockefeller Center tree. So this is very, very cool, and I'm honored to be a part of it.
Well, Christmas in New York City is magical, man. It really is. It's nostalgic. It's just iconic. It really is. It's an iconic place for Christmas. And then to be here performing and from all these people and just in this magical place is it's really, truly special. It really is.
That is one beautiful tree. And we've had beautiful weather here in southwestern Alberta. Great to see the sunshine once again today. Enjoy it while it lasts. More clouds and the wet stuff is on the way. Weather details are on deck. We had lots of sunshine again today, but slightly cooler. Tonight, just a few clouds developing with a low near -3. Mainly sunny tomorrow with a high expected near 0. A low pressure system returns on Saturday, bringing lots of clouds and rain mixed with snow and a high near 3. Much cooler on Sunday. Snow and the mercury dropping to a chilly -12. Monday mainly cloudy with a high reaching -4. Tuesday the clouds should clear out and we should get up to -3. Wednesday sunny again with a high near +1. Checking the almanac, the average high for this time of year is +1 and an average low of -11. The highest temperature on this date was recorded in 1939 at 18 degrees and the record low -34 in 1977. Sunrise was at 8:11, sunset at 4:33. Looking at tomorrow's national forecast now, expect rain and a high of 9 degrees in Victoria, BC. It should be mostly cloudy and 8 for Vancouver. A mixture of sun and cloud and -3 for Calgary on Friday. Pretty much the same picture in Edmonton with a high as well near -3. It should be overcast and -4 degrees in Regina. Clouds and -7 for Saskatoon. Light snow and -7 degrees as well for Winnipeg tomorrow. Expect flurries and 0 in Toronto. Snow and -6 for Ottawa. Flurries and -3 for Montreal. Over in the Maritimes, expect a mixture of sun and cloud and -2 in Fredericton, New Brunswick. A slight chance of flurries and +1 for Halifax, Nova Scotia. Light snow and -1 for Charlottetown, PEI. And in St. John's, Newfoundland, expect rain mixed with snow and a high near 3 degrees for tomorrow. Federal Agriculture Minister Marie-Claude Bebeau says Ottawa will ensure that dairy farmers have access to compensation since losing market share thanks to recent free trade agreements. Bebeau says compensation for the poultry and ag sectors will be finalized in the very near future. She also says it is important for the agriculture sector to have access to risk management programs. She says this will be a big topic of discussion at the next meeting with provincial and territorial ministers later this month. Two more of Canada's big banks are reporting a slump in profits as they sustained more credit losses. TD Bank Group says last year it earned $2.96 billion, but this year, for the same quarter, $2.86 billion. Adjusted earnings came in lower than expected at $1.59 per diluted share. CIBC says its fourth quarter earnings were down 6% from a year ago to $1.19 billion. Adjusted earnings were below expectations at $2.84 a share. Revenue, however, was higher than expected at $4.77 billion. Bank of Canada Deputy Governor Timothy Lane says our economy remains resilient despite global uncertainty caused by the U.S.-China trade war. Lane made the comments a day after the central bank left its key interest rate at 1.75%. Lane also talked about the idea of an insurance rate cut.
As Governor explained in the, in the October opening statement, we did look at that question then. Obviously, this time we'd already had that conversation, so and it was more a question of, well, has anything material changed? And our assessment was that the outlook still remained on track. So we didn't really reopen that question, but it's really a question of the economy having evolved pretty much in line with our outlook, and in fact the way that things have evolved is really such as to give us greater confidence in the forecast that we put out in October.
With the Christmas shopping season well underway, the Lethbridge Chamber of Commerce, Economic Development Lethbridge, and the Downtown BRZ have launched Shop Together YQL. It's a campaign aimed at encouraging residents to shop locally. Executive Officer for the Chamber, Cindy Voss, says one lucky local shopper will get to enjoy a downtown shopping spree.
The great thing is we're not just showcasing the businesses in our community that we can shop locally at, but we also want to do something positive for those people that are doing this initiative. So we are going to be giving $1,000 in downtown credit for you to shop if you post and tag this on Instagram. And it's going to be a random draw in January. And we're hoping to get lots of people showcasing the businesses that they're excited about, the people that are working in those businesses, and something very positive about the Christmas season.
The campaign, which launched today, is asking residents to share photos on Instagram of themselves shopping in Lethbridge with the hashtag ShopTogetherYQL. The contest closes on January the 5th. Now, here's a look at today's markets. The TSX was down 42 points on the day to 16,854. The Dow was up 28 points to 27,677. The S&P 500 was up almost 5 points to 3117, and the Nasdaq was up 4 points to 85.70. Oil was down 10 cents on the day to 58.33 per barrel. Natural gas was up 2 cents to $2.42. Gold was down 6 cents to $14.76 an ounce, and silver was unchanged on the day at $16.67 per ounce. Wheat is at $227 per metric ton, barley's at $230, canola's at $4.56, and corn is at $276 per metric ton. Live cattle were up 48 cents to $120.55. Feeder cattle were down 33 cents to $141.58, and lean hogs were also down 30 cents to $61.95. The Canadian dollar was down slightly on the day to 75.87 US. Recapping one of our top stories this hour, the woman who made national headlines after she was charged with causing distress to around 200 dogs in her care received her punishment yesterday. Judge Derek Redmond handed down his verdict in Lethbridge Court. April Dawn Irving has been prohibited from owning dogs the rest of her life, but only if she remains in Alberta. The 59-year-old woman was also fined more than $15,000. The honeymoon with Premier Jason Kenney appears to be over. The Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson, explains why next. But first, here's a look what's happening in and around your community.
Here's your Bridge City News Community Calendar. An annual City Hall tradition begins this week with the Sounds of the Season concert series. Enjoy your favorite holiday classics performed by various local choirs and bands during the weeks leading up to Christmas. Plus, take part in the Christmas Hope campaign by donating unwrapped toys, gifts, and non-perishable food items. For more information and performance times, visit lethbridge.ca. Come for a festive evening to Crossroads Counseling's Shine the Light Christmas celebration and fundraiser on Friday, December 6th, beginning at 6 p.m. at the Coast Lethbridge Hotel. Enjoy a full-course dinner, a silent auction, and live musical entertainment featuring the Freedom House Choir, Westside Choir, and the Evangelical Free Church Praise Choir. Tickets are $50 per person and can be purchased at the Crossroads Counseling Office. The YWCA Lethbridge and District's annual Stockings of Hope campaign is underway until Monday, December 16th. Each year, this initiative helps women in crisis experience the joy of the Christmas season by providing them with gifts and much-needed personal items. Residents and businesses can stop by the YWCA to adopt the stocking and fulfill a Christmas wish by purchasing some or all of the gifts on the list, then return the gifts unwrapped to the YWCA by December 16th. For more information about this worthy cause, call 403-329-0088. And that's your Bridge City News Community Calendar.
The UCP convention was held in Calgary recently. To talk more about it is the Alberta correspondent for the National Post and our legislative reporter, Tyler Dawson. Tyler, parents were declared the preeminent stakeholders in education policy. This was by far the most controversial resolution.
That's right. So there were a whole pile of resolutions, some of them on sort of the governance side, like whether or not boards of directors should be allowed to run as candidates, things like that, internal party stuff. And then there were all sorts of policy resolutions. And people will remember from the last time around that there were some controversies here with things like gay straight alliances in schools. That was not so much the case this time. And as you say, the exception to some extent was a couple of the education policies. In large part, it was this one where they said parents are the preeminent stakeholder. Now, a lot of the objection to this it was over very Bill Clinton in its way. It was over the use of the word the. So are parents the stakeholder, or are they one of the stakeholders? Now, the people that opposed the motion said that no, well, actually, education's about the children. The children are actually the preeminent stakeholder, and parents are just one of them. And it was controversial because some of the people seemed to think this was sort of a backdoor into some of the GSA stuff. One speaker stood up and said, look, the NDP is going to attack us over this. Why do we want to go down this road again? We're giving ammunition to our opponents. And then someone else shot back and said, well, I'm sick and tired of the NDP dictating our policies and dictating what we can have as a policy and what we can't. And there were actually some boos and some jeers for that one. And the moderator had to calm everyone down and say, this person's a member of the party. They get to say their piece. So that motion, that policy resolution did pass. But that was certainly the main time I would say that we saw a little bit of tension over the weekend when discussing party policy.
Now, a resolution in favor of the Canada Health Act failed. Is this an attack on public health care?
Well, a critic could perhaps spin it that way. Now, there were a couple sort of labor folks on Twitter doing that over the weekend, but this actually wasn't super controversial. Some people spoke in favor of it, saying that healthcare is important, it is an Albertan value, things like that. But the people who are objecting to it were saying that, look, the Canada Health Act is an invasion of provincial jurisdiction, and this and that and this and that. So that one was reasonably close, if I recall correctly, and but it did not pass. So it was an interesting one, though, that, something like that, you sometimes think that ought to be a slam dunk, but it was a little bit controversial and it didn't pass. And it remains to be seen, I think, to what extent these resolutions will become political footballs. They don't really seem to have in the last few days or so. Maybe that's just because there's so much else going on that they've got enough ammunition to go after the government as it is.
What's interesting, too, I was reading a recent tweet by NDP leader Rachel Notley, and she wants to challenge Premier Jason Kenney to a healthcare discussion. What have you been hearing about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, that is the big angst right now around the legislature and around parts of Alberta. Certainly, is it's looking like there are going to be some not insignificant cuts made in sort of frontline healthcare workers. Now, this was one of the things that sort of the UCP promised wasn't going to happen in a way, but of course, they're not writing these budgets. They're not deciding who to lay off, I think is, one of the issues at hand here. It's not Jason Kenney going into the hospitals and, laying off nurses. So this is, a road that is likely to be trodden in the next little while. And Rachel Notley is upset about it. The unions are upset about it. There's been murmurs of a general strike. We've talked about this a lot over the last 6 months, I would say, you and I, that the unions are girding for battle with the government. And it's going to get worse before it gets better I'd be quite comfortable making that prediction, I think.
Now, something else I wanted to chat with you about, Tyler, is something that was shot down recently by the education minister received some discussion, the voucher system in education. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so the voucher system seems to sort of have this cloud over it a little bit because of its affiliations with the United States. The same amount of money would be set aside per child, regardless of whether or not they are in a public school, private school, or homeschooled. So the idea is that those who choose, shall we say, alternative forms of education get, sort of more money. But this is similar to the parental stakeholder one in the sense that there are people who are very, very passionate about education as an issue. And I don't have children myself, so I must admit it's a little bit beyond my understanding, but it is one of those issues that really motivates a segment of the UCP base and a segment of the Conservative base. And, Jason Kenney has been trying to say that there's a grassroots guarantee, that they're listening to the grassroots. And there was a minor flare-up over whether or not that was the case some months ago. And this, I think, could be another one of those where delegates, many delegates in favor of something, and then the education minister is saying, well, that's just not going to happen. Some things maybe being nice policy, but make for pretty difficult politics down the road, perhaps.
Some protesters actually showed up at the UCP AGM and they marched around the hotel. They did their singing, their chanting, while UCP members just kind of kicked back and chilled.
Yeah, it was the protest kicked off quite early in the day. I mean, I got in at about 10 o'clock probably to start watching the resolutions, and gosh, people were parked, like a mile away from the venue, walking up with their signs, and there were, lots of them circling around, chanting, and as they do. It was terribly cold, so you got to give it to protesters, man. They'll go out in any weather sometimes.
Yeah.
But all was reasonably calm. A group of protesters did manage to get inside Saturday evening, and that's when they sort of came into the lobby, and folks were milling around, chatting and having drinks, and that's when they sang some of their songs and then departed with no major incident. Rick McIver, the transportation minister, said they welcomed some unexpected carolers. So that was maybe a little bit of the high drama for the weekend there.
If there's no tailgate parties going on with football games, why not go out there with your buddies and have fun and keep warm, right? Now, overall,
Exactly.
Premier Kenney called the UCP annual general meeting a huge success, and you say this is really a sign of a mature party.
I would say so. I think the fact that we did not see any major controversies it really does suggest that the party is either lining up behind Kenney or lining up behind their platform. I mean, they're still riding a wave, I think, from the election. So I would say they are very much settling in. But I mean, I think that the other thing to keep in mind is that there are the segments of the Conservative Party that Conservative leaders generally want to keep out of the spotlight, whether that's people who are pro-life, whether that's education advocates, whether that's whatever. There are, I think, segments that, for better or worse, cause a little bit of trouble for party leaders. And these people are patient. I think that is one of the reasons why social conservatives have actually made up a lot of ground in the United States over the years, is because they've been very, very, very patient. So it could be that, the controversies still lie ahead of the UCP. I think that's totally possible. But what I saw this weekend suggested a very, cohesive and confident party. And, after the victory in the spring, I think that's not a total surprise.
Well, if you want to move forward, definitely as a party, you have to be unified here, right? So federal Tory leader Andrew Scheer gave a speech. How well was it received? Did he get a lot of support from the UCP faithful?
Speaking of unity issues, yeah. So as viewers will know, he's been just attacked on all sides by his counterparts in the federal party and staffers and former party members. It's been a real mess for him. So, I think he was looking for a win when he showed up in Calgary. If a conservative leader can't come to Calgary and get standing ovations and big cheers, I mean, it's game over. And he was received, I would say, relatively warmly. A few people walked out. There were rumors of a mass protest that, hundreds of people were going to walk out. That did not materialize. Everyone was quite polite. He got a couple standing ovations. It by no means was a barn burner speech, but it was a polite reception. And on that front, I mean, Jason Kenney was asked about this at our closing press conference, and he told reporters, look, unity is a danger to the conservative movement. And I think I've said this to you before, and I've been saying it for a while now, that the Conservative Party does not want to be in the wilderness like it was in the 1990s. It does not want to be in the wilderness like the Liberal Party was for the last 10 years. So, and Jason Kenney sort of said the same thing, that he stands behind Scheer to avoid this sort of internal fighting that could cause big problems.
Now let's chit-chat a bit about the Fair Deal panel, Tyler. The government is getting a lot of input from locals. What's the main message? Is it all about cash? We need more money?
This is partly. So there's 9 separate things that they're looking at, and I won't rattle them all off here, but they vary from Alberta pension plan to having an Alberta provincial police force to having a firearms officer. There's a bunch of them. So yeah, the first one was Tuesday night in Edmonton, and it was quite interesting because critics have looked at the Kenney government and all of their public consultations and said, this looks like you guys are just giving cover. You're appointing these panels, and they're going to come back with recommendations that are going to allow you to do what you want. But actually, the other night in Edmonton, it was not totally in favor of these 9 ideas that the UCP is putting forward. There were quite a few people who stood up and said, look, Alberta is getting a great deal. Incomes are way higher here, and things like that. So it was quite interesting. Now, Edmonton, of course, not being the sort of diehard conservative city that other places in the province are. But, the panel, it's got Preston Manning on it, Stephen Lougheed, descendant of Peter Lougheed. So they heard from about 30 people over the course of the evening, mostly quite polite, only a couple of separatists. I would say a handful of people who who felt that Alberta had a fair deal, or who felt that there wasn't much on the list that was worth picking from. And so it was quite an interesting night. I think all the reporters that were there expected it to be this separatist shouting match, and wasn't that at all. It was like quite a mature, sedate meeting in some ways.
It's interesting how you bring up, Edmonton's not as conservative as other ridings, but at the same time, I'm thinking back to the federal election. It was a Tory sweep, except for one seat was NDP, not Liberal, and it was in Edmonton, right? So
isn't that the truth? And my riding, as a matter of fact, has a Conservative federal member of Parliament and an NDP member of the legislature. So
wow,
go figure.
Well, even here in Lethbridge, we've got an NDP MLA and we've got a Conservative MLA, so we're kind of split here as well. Now, a new Leger poll says Premier Jason Kenney's popularity may be slipping a little bit. You have the details on that.
Yeah, so it's dropped to about 42% of people who are, who are really backing him and feeling positively about it. And this is down from about 60 back in September, when that was sort of the last time there was major polling out. So that's on paper, that's a big jump. Now, for what it's worth, these are different polling firms. It was Angus Reid back in September that was saying 60%. So those sorts of factors can matter as well. And I'd written a little bit recently about Jason Kenney's popularity and how, he's just come off a bad month. I think, objectively speaking, he's had a rough month, from some of the spending stuff to Bill 22, where the elections commissioner was canned. He's had a rough go of it, and so I don't think it's a surprise that he has dropped in popularity, especially now that things like pensions are being talked about, things like healthcare cuts. These are tough spots for any politician, no matter how popular. But I think the important thing is we are early in this government, and I think probably Jason Kenney is savvy enough to know that if he's going to take a major hit in his popularity over something that really difficult like healthcare cuts, it's probably best to get that out of the way early, because he's got a lot of time to rebound before the next election.
Absolutely. Public sector union bosses have been throwing the word strike around, Tyler. Premier Kenney says he wants the unions to come forward in a spirit of collaboration, and says Albertans who are struggling mightily financially in places like Calgary and Red Deer may not be so sympathetic.
Yeah, so some of the unions are asking for things like an 8% pay increase, which is a lot and looks like a lot. They have been, a lot of them, been flat for a considerable number of years. So, but still, you see something like that, and you see your friends and family having to cut back, and that doesn't go over well. So I think the UCP is banking in large part on people not being super sympathetic with the demands from public sector unions. Now, they are, I think, trying to massage this a little bit and say that we do value the public sector. They are partners in having a more efficient government. But as you mentioned, Kenney said, look, we don't want to be in a sort of a general strike situation. We want the unions to work with us and meet somewhere in the middle, and so on and so forth. Which we will see if that happens. I think that sounds all fine and good, but I think to some extent it misunderstands what unions are there for, and they aren't there to make everyday Albertans feel good. They aren't there to make the Premier feel good. They're there to do whatever they can for their members, and sometimes that's really unpopular.
The Council of Confederation wrapped up with the Premier's meeting in Toronto recently, and Premier Kenney secured an agreement on relief from federal transfers for our province, and the Premier's pushed for reforms to Bill C-69, which is good news for our energy sector.
Yeah, so these are some of the things that Jason Kenney had pushed for back in July at the last Council of the Federation, which was in Saskatoon. And he had some difficulty, I should say, obtaining agreement. And he seems to have gotten some agreement on this. Now, what that will look like in the future is hard to say. I certainly think that the federal government has shown some willingness on Bill C-69 to rethink it a little bit. Do we see it reopened fully? Maybe not. Do we see it scrapped fully? I suspect not. But, this is one of the challenges for Jason Kenney, or pardon me, for Justin Trudeau going ahead, is he does have a coalition of Conservative premiers who represent huge swaths of the country, and he is going to have a difficult time in a minority government situation to not look at what the premiers are saying and pay close attention to it, I think. So we will see what comes of that, but certainly the Alberta government's feeling pretty good about that from what I've been hearing this week.
And speaking of the energy sector, it sounds like pipe will finally be laid by Christmas. For the Transmont pipeline expansion should be completed by the year 2023. And Tyler, it'll triple the capacity of getting our products to market, so that's good news as well.
Excellent news. And earlier this week, Enbridge's Line 3 came online for the Canada portion of it. So it's actually been a decently good news week for pipeline politics. As you say, these construction on TMX they were hoping to have got this underway ages ago. But yes, by Christmas, they're hoping to be putting pipe in the ground. There is another court challenge coming up so goodness knows what could happen there. This is whether or not the pipeline approvals process was again good enough. So we are not out of the water yet. But again, very positive noises coming from the province this week. They're feeling quite good about this.
Our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson, joining me from Edmonton. Thanks so much, Tyler.
Thanks so much.
A private clinic in BC called the Cambie Centre is challenging the constitutionality of the province's healthcare regulations. Now the question is, should the government be able to stop people from spending their own money on a legal service which would solve a health problem or even save their life? Joining me now is Derek Fromm. He's a staff lawyer with the Canadian Constitution Foundation. Derek, welcome to Bridge City News.
Thank you very much.
Now, can you briefly share a bit with our audience some of the background of this case and with an update as to where we stand right now?
Sure. In 2016, the Canadian Constitution Foundation and Cambie Clinics went to court in BC at the Supreme Court, which is the lowest level of court there, and we started litigation against two provisions in BC law. And so what we anticipated as being 26 weeks of court time has now blossomed into 3 years. But there's a longer history. In fact, this litigation goes all the way back to 2009. And since then, the Cambie Clinic, the BC government, and other interested parties have been wrangling with these legal matters. And it only came to court in 2016, but just recently, in the last few weeks here, it's been starting to wrap up, and we anticipate that the government will be making their final arguments sometime around Christmas.
So essentially, we have a law that bars patients from paying for necessary medical care, which some see as a violation of their charter rights.
That's correct. So what we're challenging is two provisions in BC law. The first, as you mentioned, is a prohibition on private healthcare insurance. So this is the sort of healthcare insurance that people would be allowed to buy that would cover such things that the government already says it covers. So like a hip replacement, knee surgery, things like that the government system already purportedly covers. In BC law, you cannot buy health insurance for those types of procedures. Now, also, we are challenging a provision that says that doctors must enroll in either the public or the private system. They cannot have a dual practice in one or one and the other at the same time. They must choose between the two. Now, those two things together create a sort of problem in BC. It is not financially possible for doctors to have a purely private practice, and patients cannot afford to pay out of pocket for the sort of medical procedures that they might need.
You know, a lot of people would argue the fact that medical care needs to go to those who need it the most, not to someone who can pay the most. How do you respond to that?
Well, that's exactly right. And we would completely agree with that. And now, part of the thing that we're challenging in BC, one of the laws we're challenging, is the prohibition on private insurance. So currently, when someone who is very wealthy has a problem with their hip or has a heart condition and they are put in a government wait list, what ends up happening is they are able to afford to leave the country and get medical attention immediately. But somebody who does not have that sort of means is forced to wait, languish, and suffer and risk their health and risk death waiting for the medical treatment that they require. And with private insurance, that would go a long way to helping solve that sort of problem of equalizing the medical system and making it more equitable in BC.
You know what's interesting as well, Derek, is over the last 20 years or so, BC premiers have chosen not to enforce the laws prohibiting patients from getting diagnostic tests and surgeries from the private Cambie Clinic, and there doesn't seem to be any clear evidence that this has stopped regular people from getting health care?
Well, that's absolutely correct. And in fact, there's many people in BC that are able to queue jump and get right to the front of the list and seek medical care, including at Cambie. So for instance, if you're a member of the RCMP, or if you're a member of the armed forces, or you're a federal prisoner, you will get right to the front of the queue and you will get medical treatment right away. But it's those ordinary British Columbia residents, the children, the mothers, retired folks that don't have those sort of connections, or that sort of the characteristics that allow them to queue jump like that, they're the ones that end up languishing and suffering and waiting in pain for medically necessary treatments in BC without being able to solve these sorts of problems on their own.
You know, I do understand that some people would feel discriminated against if someone with money, good cold hard cash, they can actually get surgery faster than they can. But how can we deny and justify that someone should continue to suffer if they're able to afford faster treatment?
Well, I don't think we should be forcing them to suffer, and that really is the crux of the case. See, this case is all about legalizing healthcare. No mother, no child, no retired person, no one in BC should be forced to wait on a healthcare wait list while their health deteriorates, they're risking their health, they're risking their death, waiting for medically necessary treatment in a BC public healthcare facility. And if this is something that the BC government simply can't provide to people in a fair and equitable fashion, in a timely fashion, then it must get out of the way. It must get out of the way so that patients and doctors can work together to solve these problems in a timely and fair fashion. Now, simply put, again, to reiterate this case is all about legalizing healthcare in BC, allowing patients and doctors to solve problems together. And if the government won't do this for BC residents, it's violating some of the most important constitutional rights that define us as Canadians, namely Section 7 of the Charter, those rights including life, liberty, and security of the person. And with those at risk, the BC government, I think, is risking a lot in court with us, and hopefully we have a good decision when the decision comes out.
Derek, is it true that Canadian doctors can in fact open a private clinic as long as they're not part of the public healthcare system?
Now, Canada, the legislation throughout Canada is provincial. So Canada is a patchwork. Now, here in this province of Alberta, it's not the case, is my understanding. You have to, if you're going to open a surgical facility, it has to be government inspected and effectively government owned. In BC, that's not the case. Now, in Saskatchewan, things are different. And again, in other places across the country, like Newfoundland doesn't have any sorts of these restrictions. And in Quebec doesn't have any ban on private insurance. Saskatchewan doesn't have a ban on private insurance. So you really have to look province by province. But the fact is, in BC, private healthcare is perfectly legal. There is a dual practice, there's I guess, two-tiered medicine in BC. That's the way it works. But the problem, again, is that patients can't buy insurance, so they have to pay out of pocket for all the expenses of the medical care they receive. And at the same time, doctors must either be in the public or the private system. They can't be in both. And so those two things together effectively create these long waiting lists in BC. And that's problematic because government actually does ration care. So there's much evidence of this at trial. And one good example is bariatric surgery. So bariatric surgery, the wait lists in BC a number of years ago were around 500 people waiting on an annual basis for bariatric surgery. And the government capped surgical procedures at 50 per year, which meant that if you were number 51 on the list, you were waiting until next year. If you were number 300 on the list, you were waiting for years. Now, what happens is when you're waiting for surgery, you're in pain. It might be knee surgery or hip surgery. You might miss the best period of your children's lives. You might not be able to play with them because of your health condition. You might be risking further problems with your health, like one of our clients in the Canby case who suffered irreparable spinal damage and became paralyzed. Or you could risk death, as another one of our patients who fortunately did not die, but she was able to seek timely medical services through a private facility in BC. So these are real problems. There are real people that are suffering and in pain in BC on these waiting lists. And as a famous Canadian case said, the Shuley decision out of Quebec over 10 years ago said, access to a waiting list is not access to health care. And it's a very important distinction. Just because the government has surgical facilities and can do the surgical procedures for you in their facility doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get it in a timely and effective way that will preserve your health. And if your health is at risk and you're suffering, it becomes a constitutional violation when the government doesn't allow you to solve your own medical problems.
You know, like you mentioned earlier as well, I mean, not allowing a combination of private and public health care, many Canadians are going to say, we don't want to be like the United States, right? Two-tiered healthcare system. But if we're talking about a similar system to what countries like Germany, Sweden, and the UK are using, why are we opposed to something that has a great track record?
Well, that's a very good question. I'm never really sure why we always compare ourselves to the U.S. other than they're geographically close to us. It seems to be somewhat of a bogeyman, and I would like to see us compare ourselves more to France or the UK, Sweden, the European countries that actually have been functioning very well with a public and a private system in tandem. We shouldn't just be stuck into this mindset that we just have one healthcare system for all, we all have to be in it. And in my opinion, that's what's led to our poor results when you see our healthcare system ranked in the OECD studies. We're always near the bottom of the OECD countries in ranking of healthcare outcomes. And I believe that's at least partially because we haven't allowed doctors and patients to come together to solve problems. And if the government would simply get out of the way in cases like this, patients would be able to work with their doctors and develop solutions to the medical issues that they're facing.
I understand that the Nurses Union argues that private health care causes doctors to double bill. Is that true?
Well, that is actually a subject of some consternation, because in BC, what they define double billing as is something very different from what it sounds like it should be. Now, when I say double billing to one of my friends on the street, they would think, well, the doctor is billing the government and billing the patient simultaneously. But BC law doesn't necessarily view it that way. The BC law views it as if you bill the patient for it, and you could have billed the government, regardless of if you do or not, that is double billing. And so that is a matter of some interpretation, let's put it that way. And in fact, that's what started this Cambie litigation off in the first place, because way back in 2009, the Nurses Union in BC actually sued the government of BC, saying, look, there's private facilities in this province that are double billing. Now, it was never proved in court what that was or what definition should be used, but when Cambie then became implicated by this lawsuit against the BC government, Dr. Brian Day, the owner of Cambie, then turned around and had to start his constitutional challenge to maintain his clinic, because what was going to happen is potentially he could be shut down. So that was really the start of this litigation back in 2009. And so whether or not that's true hasn't been proven in court, and I don't really know what to say about that at this point.
Now, is it true that BC actually places a cap on the number of surgeries that can be done? And if so, why? Would that not limit the ability to make use of available facilities and doctors?
Absolutely. And every province does this. This is like how sausage is made in the healthcare system. When at the beginning of the year, governments have a budget and they say we're able to spend X number of dollars on healthcare. And then as it goes through the process of deciding how that money is to be spent, what ends up happening is certain numbers of procedures are determined to be affordable under that budget. And so when I talked about bariatric surgery before, that's a perfect example. There's 50 bariatric procedures that were able to be done in BC in, I'm going to say 2015. I think that was the date. And before that, it was a higher number, but budgetary restrictions came in and it was reduced to 15. And so what happens to those surgical facilities when the budgets are reduced? Well, they sit empty. Doctors might twiddle their thumbs. They're looking for work. And the fact is that the facilities are there, the people are there to perform it, but the money isn't. And that's the government's budgetary decisions that are rationing, are saying up front how many procedures can be performed per year. And that happens across the country. And in this case, when we're talking about BC, it's the BC facts that are important. And in BC, yes, that absolutely does happen. And so what ends up happening is that creates waiting lists. And so if you're on the list, but you're not scheduled to be done this year because there's not enough money in the government's budget, then you have to wait till next year or the following year to get your procedure. Meanwhile, you're in pain, you're watching your health deteriorate, and you're maybe even risking death. And this is a problem because you're not allowed to buy private insurance in BC. You cannot jump the queue, as it were, and get private insurance and go to a private facility. You would have to pay completely 100% out of pocket. And in our opinion, that's not fair. That's not equitable. That punishes people who don't have the means to do that.
Derek, some people say the government should make it illegal to travel to another country for surgery, even life-saving surgery. Just get in line with everybody else. How do you respond to that?
Well, that would just make the problems that we're having worse, wouldn't it? Now, everyone has to suffer. It's just a fact of life. There's only so much money that can be put into private healthcare. The government either will have to tax us a lot more, or will have to find enormous efficiencies in the system to get rid of the wait lists. It's funny. There's a study released by C.D. Howe a number of years ago that kind of showed what's on the horizon for Canada as our population ages, as healthcare becomes more expensive. Already in provinces like BC, Alberta included, healthcare is right around the 50% of the provincial budget, and that is slated to increase enormously in coming years. This is a wall of reality that we're coming up against. We simply cannot afford to keep things functioning the way they are now. We need to find new ways to deliver healthcare. We need to find efficiencies. And one of the best ways to do that is to allow patients and doctors to come together to solve problems on their own. Allow people to buy private insurance. Come up with new ways of allowing doctors to practice in public and private simultaneously. It could be as simple as saying, if you want to perform surgeries in the private sector, you have to put in 50 surgeries in the public sector. It could be something simple like that. We just need to unleash this, unleash the market on this, because right now people are suffering and dying. And as the Supreme Court said in Truly, access to a wait list is not access to healthcare. It can't be more clear than that.
Derek Fromm, staff lawyer with the Canadian Constitutional Foundation. Thanks a lot for joining me today from Chestermere Lake, Alberta.
Thank you.
On behalf of all of us here at BCN, I'm Hal Roberts. God bless, and thanks so much for watching.